Welcome to Sci-Fi Traveler, friends. I'm here with a fantastic episode. In this episode, we'll be listening to the story of Logan and Nora. If you're ready, Sci-Fi Traveler is about to begin. Enjoy the show. The Planetary Registry of Novel City had never, in its 217-year operational history, returned a blank, not once. It had identified a smuggler hiding inside a refrigerated cargo unit filled with contraband Velian spice. It had flagged a diplomat who had surgically altered his fingerprints and his face and his vocal signature, and still, been caught because the system had matched the particular rhythm of his blinking. It had once, famously, identified a man who had been legally dead for 11 years, which created a bureaucratic problem so spectacular that 3 separate academic papers had been written about it. The registry did not miss things. The registry was, in the words of the woman who had designed it, effectively omniscient within a radius of 40 light seconds. Logan stood at the city gates for 6 seconds before it returned a blank. The gate officer, whose name was Samuel and who had worked the morning shift for 9 years without incident, stared at his screen for a long moment. Then he looked up at the man standing on the other side of the scanner arch. The man was unremarkable in almost every visible way. Average height, calm posture, a jacket that looked like it had survived at least one planetary re-entry and hadn't entirely forgiven whoever had put it through that. He had a bag over one shoulder. He was not carrying a weapon, at least not one the scanner could detect, which was either reassuring or deeply alarming depending on how you thought about it. Samuel looked back at his screen. Still blank. He tapped it twice, the way people tap screens when they are hoping the machine is simply having a moment. The screen was not having a moment. The screen was, by every available indicator, functioning perfectly. It simply had nothing to say about this particular human being, which was, and Samuel would later use this exact phrase in his incident report, categorically impossible. "Sir," Samuel said carefully, "I'm going to need you to step to the side." The man, Logan, as he would introduce himself approximately 40 minutes later to 4 increasingly frustrated security personnel, stepped to the side without complaint, without hurry, and with the air of someone who had expected exactly this and had budgeted the time for it. What followed was, by the standards of Novel City's Central Security Division, a quietly extraordinary 3 days. Biological scans were run 6 times because the first 5 results were identical and the supervisor didn't believe them. His genetic sequence, when finally isolated, was human. Unambiguously, boringly human. But matched nothing in any Federation database, any colonial record, any archived medical file from any of the 11 inhabited systems currently under Federation registry. His retinal pattern was human. His voice pattern was human. His DNA was human. He was, according to every available instrument, a perfectly ordinary human man who had apparently never existed. The intelligence agencies arrived on the second day. There were 4 of them, representing 3 systems and 1 independent station that technically didn't have the jurisdiction to be there but came anyway, which everyone found irritating but nobody had the energy to address. They shared data with the reluctant politeness of people who do not trust each other and are not particularly trying to hide it. They cross-referenced. They queried. They sent urgent encrypted requests to archives that had not been accessed in decades. They came back with nothing, which they each blamed quietly on the other 3. Logan spent most of this time in an interrogation room on the 14th floor of Central Command. It was a well-designed room, neutral gray walls, a table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, and a lighting system calibrated to be subtly uncomfortable without being technically classified as a hostile environment. Someone had put a great deal of thought into it. Logan seemed, if anything, mildly entertained by it. He slept when he was tired. He ate what was brought to him without complaint. When questioned, he answered with his name and nothing else, not because he was being hostile, but with the patient quality of a man who understood that the right moment had not yet arrived. On the morning of the 3rd day, General Adrian, a compact, silver-haired woman who had spent 30 years being unimpressed by things that impressed other people, stood behind the 2-way mirror and watched Logan read what appeared to be an invisible text on the surface of the table, tracing letters with one finger in a way that was either a nervous habit or a code, and she said to no one in particular, "Bring me Nora." The room went slightly quiet. Her aide, a young man named Carter who was very good at his job and had learned early that the most useful thing he could do was absorb information without reacting to it, made a note and said nothing. The two intelligence representatives standing nearby exchanged a glance, the kind that contains an entire conversation about things neither party wants to say out loud. One of them started to say something. Adrian looked at him. He stopped. "Bring me Nora," she said again, which was not, technically, saying it again so much as making it final. Carter made the call. 40 minutes later, the elevator on the east side of the 14th floor opened, and Nora walked out into the corridor with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had decided, some centuries ago, that rushing was a choice she was no longer willing to make. She was pale in the way that certain winter mornings are pale, not absent of color, but luminous with it, as though the light was coming from somewhere slightly behind her skin. Her dark hair was pulled back without ceremony. Her ears came to a soft point at the tip, half hidden by the fall of her hair. Easy to miss if you weren't looking. Impossible to forget once you had. She was dressed plainly and carried nothing. She acknowledged the general with a look that was respectful in the way that equals are respectful, rather than the way subordinates are. She stopped at the mirror. On the other side of the glass, Logan had stopped tracing letters on the table. He was sitting perfectly still now, hands folded, looking at the wall in front of him with an expression that nobody in the observation room could quite read. "That's him?" Nora said. "That's him," said Adrian. Nora looked through the glass for a long moment. Something moved across her face. Not quite an emotion, or rather, an emotion that arrived too quickly and was managed too late. She pressed her lips together once, briefly, and then she was composed again, or close enough that only someone paying very careful attention would have noticed the difference. "All right," she said quietly. She pushed open the door and walked in. The room was very quiet, not the performed quiet of a tense negotiation, or the brittle quiet of two strangers sizing each other up. This was a different kind, the kind that comes when two people who have not seen each other in a very long time find themselves in the same room unexpectedly, and neither of them is quite ready to be the one who speaks first. The generals behind the glass had stopped arguing. Carter had stopped typing. Even the environmental system seemed to have reduced its ambient hum out of some mechanical instinct for discretion. Nora sat down across from Logan and placed her hands flat on the table, which was less a gesture of openness and more, he suspected, something to do with the fact that her hands were not entirely steady. Logan looked at her. She looked at him. The two-way mirror reflected nothing useful back at the people standing behind it. "You look well," Logan said finally. "You look exactly the same," Nora said, which was not a compliment so much as an observation with complicated edges. "I'll take it." "You shouldn't." She studied his face with the focused attention of someone reading a document they've read before but are checking for changes. "You know what they've been doing out there for 3 days." "I have some idea." 4 intelligence agencies." "I heard." "From where?" "You don't have a communicator. You don't have a signal. You don't, according to every piece of equipment on this floor, technically exist." She said this last part without heat, but there was something underneath it, not quite anger, not quite relief, that she was visibly choosing not to examine in public. "How did you get here, Logan?" He considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Carefully," he said. Behind the glass, one of the intelligence representatives wrote something down. Adrian watched Nora's face and did not write anything down. "They want answers," Nora said. "They always do. These ones have significantly more weapons than usual." "That part I also noticed." He glanced briefly toward the mirror, not with any particular concern, but with the acknowledgement of a man who knows exactly where all the cameras are and has decided they're someone else's problem. "What did they tell you when they called?" Nora's mouth curved slightly at one corner. It was not quite a smile. It was the shape a smile leaves behind after it's decided the moment isn't quite right. "They told me there was a man in an interrogation room who matched no known record in any living database and who had been cooperative but uninformative and whose presence had caused a minor diplomatic incident between 3 systems in under 72 hours. She paused. "They described it as unprecedented." High praise. It wasn't meant as praise. "I know. I liked it anyway." She looked at him for a moment longer, And then something shifted in the room. The slight tectonic shift of two people deciding, independently and simultaneously, to stop circling and begin. Nora leaned back in her chair. It was a small movement, but it changed the architecture of the conversation. "How long?" she asked. He understood the question. It was not about the 3 days. "Since Callian." The word landed in the quiet, like a stone dropped into still water. Nora held it there for a moment without reacting, which was itself a kind of reaction, and one that Adrian, watching through the glass, filed carefully away. "That's not possible," Nora said. Her voice was even. Her voice was very deliberately even. "You've said that to me before. About different things. And were you right those times?" She didn't answer immediately. Outside the observation window, Novel City continued its afternoon in the indifferent way that cities do. Transit lanes humming with atmospheric craft, the lower districts glowing amber beneath a sky that was perpetually the particular shade of blue that happens when two moons are up and one isn't. Inside, Carter had quietly stopped breathing and was only now remembering to start again. "Callian was 400 years ago," Nora said. 411. Logan said, with the mild precision of someone correcting a detail that matters. "You always round down." "I round to the nearest century. It's more manageable." "For historians, maybe." She stared at him. "You are not 411 years old." "I know it's a lot." He said this with a tone of genuine, disarming reasonableness. I was surprised too, initially. "Logan, the first 100 were the strangest, honestly. After that, you develop routines." "Logan, I found that having a hobby helps. I've learned several instruments. I'm very good at 2 of them. The others I play only in private, as a courtesy to others." "Would you," Nora said, with enormous patience, "please say something that is not completely absurd for approximately 30 consecutive seconds?" He looked at her. The humor faded, not disappeared, but settled, the way humor does when it has been serving as scaffolding and the structure beneath it is finally ready to hold its own weight. His eyes, in the flat light of the interrogation room, were the dark, calm eyes of someone who had spent a very long time observing things and had made a kind of peace with most of them. "I came here because I needed to find you," he said. "And because the last time I found you, it was in a situation considerably less comfortable than this one, and I thought a public location with armed guards might actually be the more civilized option." Nora was quiet. She turned one hand over on the table, palm up, a gesture so small that the cameras almost certainly missed it. "What situation?" she said. "A long one. I'll need more than 30 seconds. "I have time." "I know you do." Something passed through his expression, gratitude, or something adjacent to it, worn smooth by long handling. "That was always the one thing I could count on. You have more time than anyone." Behind the glass, General Adrian turned to Carter and said very quietly, "Get me everything we have on a place called Callian." Carter, who had been in intelligence work for 11 years and had believed until approximately 4 minutes ago that he had a reasonable understanding of what was and wasn't historically possible, nodded once and started typing with the focused urgency of a man who has just discovered that the ground beneath him is not where he thought it was. Nora looked at Logan across the table. Logan looked back. Between them, 4 centuries of silence sat with the particular weight of something that had been carried a long way and was very ready to be set down. "All right," she said, for the second time that afternoon. But this time, it meant something different entirely. Carter found 3 references to Callian in the Federation's historical archive. This was, given that the Federation's historical archive contained approximately 9 billion indexed entries across 4 centuries of documented interstellar activity, a number that could charitably be described as thin. The first reference was a navigational footnote in a survey report from 230 years ago, noting that a star system designated C7741 in the outer Valen corridor had been observed, catalogued, and found to contain nothing of resource interest. The second was a single line in an archaeological review from 80 years later, suggesting that ruins of pre-Federation origin had been detected on the third planet of C7741, but that a follow-up expedition had been deprioritized due to budget constraints, which Carter thought was exactly the kind of decision that aged terribly. The third reference was a footnote in a historical linguistics paper about extinct symbolic languages, and it said only, "The Callian inscriptions remain untranslated. See primary source, if primary source can be located." The primary source could not be located. Carter printed all three documents, stared at them for a moment, and then went to find General Adrian. Adrian read them in the corridor outside the observation room with the expression of someone who has been handed a map with a large section replaced by the words, "Here be significant problems." She handed them back without comment and returned to the mirror. Inside the interrogation room, Nora and Logan had shifted. Not physically. They were still on opposite sides of the table. But the quality of the space between them had changed. It was less careful now. Something had been decided, or perhaps simply acknowledged, and the conversation had moved into deeper water. "You need to start from the beginning," Nora said. "The beginning is complicated. Then start from somewhere you can explain and work outward." Logan turned his hands over on the table, palms up, an unconscious mirror of what she had done earlier. He looked at them for a moment as though checking that they were still his. "After Callian," he said, "after everything, I woke up on a transit hauler 3 systems away with no memory of the previous 6 months and a cargo manifest that listed me as agricultural equipment." Nora stared at him. "Specifically," Logan continued, "I was listed as a hydroponic irrigation unit, Model 7. I don't know what a Model 7 looks like, but I'm told they're quite reliable. How does a person get listed as agricultural equipment? Carefully, and with the help of someone who clearly had a dark sense of humor and access to a cargo registry." He paused. "I've always assumed it was Riven." The name registered in Nora's expression like a minor tremor, there and gone, but definitely there. "Riven has been dead for 3 centuries. Riven has been officially dead for 3 centuries. Riven has been actually dead for what I estimate is closer to 40 years, which I know because I attended the funeral, which was very small and held on a station that technically doesn't appear on any Federation chart, which I realize sounds like I'm describing a pattern." Nora looked at him for a long, measured moment. Outside, Novel City's afternoon light was shifting toward the amber of early evening, and the observation room's overhead lighting had adjusted accordingly, casting everything in a slightly warmer tone that did nothing to reduce the absolute strangeness of the conversation. "You've been moving through the outer systems," she said. Not a question. "For most of it, yes. The Inner Federation is thorough. Their registries, their scans. It became easier to stay near the edges. The border stations are less attentive. They're looking outward, not inward. And you've been doing what, exactly, for 4 centuries on the outer edges?" He seemed to consider how to answer this. "Existing," he said, which was honest but not particularly complete. Then, "watching, learning. The outer systems have their own histories, Nora. Things that didn't make it into the Federation's archive because the Federation wasn't there to record them. Civilizations that rose and declined before the inner systems had working faster than light travel. Languages that were never translated because there was no one left to ask." He looked up at her. "I've been filling in some of the gaps." There was a quality to the way he said it that made Nora very still. Not the words themselves, but something underneath them. The weight of a man who had spent 400 years doing a thing quietly and alone, and was only now saying it out loud to someone who would understand what it had cost. "You found something," she said. "I found several things, but yes, one thing in particular." Behind the glass, Adrian made a small gesture to Carter, who was already recording. One of the intelligence representatives had taken out a device and was holding it toward the glass in a way that was technically not permitted, and that Adrian chose, in this instance, not to address. "The Callian inscriptions," Logan said. "The ones the linguists said were untranslatable. I know what they are. Better than the linguists do, I'd imagine." "I was there when they were made," Nora said, very quietly. So yes, marginally better. They're not untranslatable, Logan said. They were never untranslatable. They were written to look that way. Written to be found by someone who already knew the language and would understand why they'd been disguised. He reached into the inside pocket of his battered jacket, a movement that caused two armed officers in the corridor to come very briefly to full attention, and placed on the table a small, flat device, matte black, roughly the size of a closed hand, with no visible interface. I've had this for 6 years. It took me 11 years before that to locate it, and another 8 years before that to understand what I was looking for. Nora looked at the device. She did not touch it. Her expression had become the very careful, very neutral expression of someone who is experiencing something significant and has decided for the moment to keep it on the inside. That's a Callian relay, she said. It is. Those don't exist anymore. This one does. He left his hand beside it, not touching it either. It's been active for approximately 25 years, sending on a frequency that no current Federation instrument is calibrated to receive. He looked at her steadily. But you would receive it, wouldn't you? The observation room was absolutely silent. Carter had stopped typing. The intelligence representative with the handheld device had lowered it without noticing he'd done so. Nora looked at the relay. Then she looked at Logan. Her ivory skin, in the amber light of late afternoon, carried that faint luminescence that was not quite explainable by biology or physics, and that she had long since stopped trying to account for. Her pointed ears were still half hidden by her hair. She looked, to anyone watching through the glass, entirely composed, but her hands, flat on the table, pressed down just slightly. Just enough. You came all this way, she said. Walked through a planetary registry that has never once returned a blank, got yourself detained by 4 intelligence agencies, and sat in this room for 3 days to tell me that someone has been sending a signal on a Callian frequency. Yes, on a relay that shouldn't exist. Yes. She looked at him for a long moment. Who? She said. Logan's expression, for the first time since she had walked through the door, shifted into something that was not calm. It wasn't fear exactly. It was closer to the look of a man who has been carrying a very specific piece of news across 400 years and has finally arrived at the person it was meant for. That, he said, is what I need your help to find out. General Adrian had a rule, developed over 30 years of military intelligence work, that she applied to situations of genuine uncertainty. When you encounter something you don't understand, stop adding instruments and start asking better questions. She had seen colleagues respond to the inexplicable by layering scan upon scan, protocol upon protocol, until the original mystery was buried under so much procedure that no one could find it anymore. She had always considered this a form of institutional panic dressed in the clothing of thoroughness. She did not intend to make the same mistake. She left the observation room at 6:30 and walked around to the interrogation room door and knocked once, which was not standard protocol, but which was, she had decided, the appropriate register for this particular evening. She opened the door without waiting for an answer, stepped inside, and placed 2 cups of coffee on the table. Real coffee, not the synthesized variant that the 14th floor's dispensary produced, but actual ground coffee from the commissary 2 levels down, which she had sent Carter for specifically, because if this conversation was going to happen, it was going to happen with decent coffee. Nora looked at the cups. Then she looked at Adrian with an expression that contained, among other things, a faint and genuine surprise. "Thank you," Nora said. "Don't," Adrian said, pulling the 3rd chair from the corner where it had been placed against the wall, presumably to make the room feel more oppressive. She set it at the end of the table and sat down. "I'm not being generous. I want you both to keep talking, and in my experience, people talk better when they have something to do with their hands." She looked at Logan. "You're going to tell me what a Callian relay is." Logan looked at Nora. Nora looked at the coffee for a moment, then picked it up, which seemed to constitute a decision. Callian, Nora said, was a civilization that existed in the Outer Velen corridor approximately 450 years before the first Federation Charter was signed. They were not, she added, with the careful precision of someone correcting a common misunderstanding that particularly irritates them, primitive. They were in several measurable respects more technologically advanced than the Federation is today. They simply developed differently, less interested in expansion, more interested in depth. Depth, Adrian said. Communication across time rather than distance. Preservation of knowledge. The construction of systems designed to survive not decades, but millennia. Nora turned the coffee cup in her hands. The relay is one of those systems, a device built to transmit on a biological frequency, keyed not to a machine receiver, but to a specific living physiology, designed to be received by a specific kind of person. By you, Adrian said. By people like me, yes. Adrian absorbed this. She was very good at absorbing things. And how many people like you are there? Fewer than there used to be. This was said with a flatness that closed the subject firmly enough that even Adrian, who had made a career of opening closed subjects, left it alone. The signal, Logan said, has been transmitting for 25 years on a rotation cycle consistent with Callian long-range protocols. That means it isn't a recording. It isn't a residual echo from old hardware. Something is actively maintaining it. He turned the small black relay on the table once with one finger, a slow rotation, like someone spinning a coin in thought. The Callian didn't build things that ran autonomously. Everything in their infrastructure was tended, maintained. They believed that untended systems became dishonest over time. Untended systems, Adrian said slowly, like a civilization that no longer exists. Yes. So something is tending this one. Or someone. The room held that word for a moment. Outside, the city had moved into its evening configuration, the transit lanes shifting to lower altitude patterns, the ambient light of 1,000 windows beginning to outnumber the fading sky. Carter appeared briefly in the doorway, with a look that asked whether he was needed, and received a look from Adrian that sent him back to his desk. I want to ask you something, Adrian said to Logan, with the tone of a woman who was going to ask it regardless of his feelings on the matter. And I want you to understand that I'm not asking it as an accusation. I'm asking it because I'm sitting in a room with a man who doesn't exist in any database and a woman who has just calmly explained that she predates the Federation by several centuries, and I have a professional obligation to at least attempt to understand what's happening. That seems entirely fair, Logan said. What are you? Logan looked at her. Technically human, he said. Structurally, biologically, genetically, human. Every scan you ran will confirm it. They did confirm it. That's not what I asked. He was quiet for a moment. Nora did not fill the silence, which Adrian noted. She was the kind of woman, apparently, who knew when a silence belonged to someone else. I was in Callian when it ended, Logan said. I was there for reasons that aren't important to the present situation. What matters is that when Callian ended, it didn't end cleanly. There was an event, a final project they'd been working on, something they built into the infrastructure of the place itself. He paused. I was in the wrong location at the wrong time, which is a description that is both accurate and entirely insufficient. And this event did what, exactly, to you? It's unclear still after 4 centuries, which I'll admit is a somewhat humbling data point. He said this with the equanimity of a man who has had 4 centuries to become equanimous about it. I don't age. I don't appear in registries. My biological signature exists outside the parameters that standard scanners are calibrated for. I am, by most practical definitions, invisible to the infrastructure of the modern Federation. He turned his hands over again. I've had a lot of time to think about what they were trying to build. My current best theory is that it was a kind of preservation system, like the relay, designed to last. They preserved you, Adrian said. I think they preserved the possibility of a specific kind of work. I just happened to be standing in it when it activated. Adrian looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Nora. And you knew him before this happened? Yes, Nora said. In Callian. Yes. 400 years ago. 411, Logan said. Nora gave him a look. She rounds, he explained to Adrian. It's a habit. I find it charming in the way that one finds endlessly recurring minor inaccuracies charming after 4 centuries. You find it irritating, Nora said. I find it endearingly irritating, which is different and considerably more affectionate. Adrian set down her coffee cup with the deliberateness of a woman recalibrating. The signal, she said, returning them both to the point with the practiced ease of someone who has run 10,000 meetings. You said you need her help to find out who's sending it. What kind of help? The relay receives, Logan said. It doesn't locate. To trace the origin of the transmission, I need access to a bioresonance mapping system, something that can read the Callian frequency band and triangulate the source. He looked at Nora directly. There is exactly one such system in the known Federation. It's not in any public registry. It's not in any intelligence database. The corner of his mouth moved slightly. But you know where it is. Nora was quiet for a moment that stretched just long enough to confirm that he was right. It's in the Voss archive, she said finally. I know. The Voss archive is on a station that the Federation has classified as structurally compromised and off-limits for the last 60 years. I know that too. It's also, she said, with the measured tone of someone listing complications not as objections but as items requiring planning, on the far edge of the Velan corridor, which is currently the subject of a disputed territorial claim between two systems who have been aggressively unpleasant about it. Yes, she looked at him. You've thought about all of this already. I've had 6 years with the relay and a great deal of unscheduled time. Adrian looked between them with the expression of a woman who has, in the last 40 minutes, revised her understanding of history, physics, and the operational parameters of her own jurisdiction. Then she did the thing that had made her exceptional at her work for 30 years. She made a decision. You'll need a ship, she said. The ship Adrian provided was called the Meridian, which Logan thought was a reasonable name for a vessel, and Nora thought was the kind of name that people gave ships when they wanted them to sound more purposeful than they were. It was a mid-range scout class, fast and narrow, with a sensor suite that was 3 generations ahead of what its exterior suggested, and a crew compartment designed for 4 that felt, once you were inside it, like it had been designed for 2 people who liked each other and 2 people who were willing to tolerate each other. The Federation emblem on its hull had been replaced with a neutral transit registration that wouldn't draw attention in contested space. Carter had arranged this in under 6 hours, which Logan found impressive, and which Carter accepted with the exhausted satisfaction of a man who has been doing impossible things on short notice for so long that it has simply become his baseline. Adrian had given them 3 conditions. The first was that they take a monitoring device, a small passive recorder that would log their route and any significant encounters, not transmitting in real time, but archiving for review on return. Nora had agreed to this without hesitation, which told Adrian something. The second condition was that they check in at the Velan corridor's outer way station before proceeding into disputed territory. Logan had agreed to this with the mild compliance of a man who doesn't intend to be difficult about the things that don't matter. The third condition was that they come back, which was not technically an operational parameter, but which Adrian had included anyway, looking at Nora when she said it in a way that made it something more than procedural. They left Novel City at an hour that was technically early morning, but felt in the way of departures like its own particular time outside of ordinary time. The city's transit lanes were at their quietest, a few cargo haulers running pre-dawn routes, an atmospheric ferry moving between the upper residential tiers, the soft navigation lights of the station's orbital ring visible above the cloud layer like a second, more orderly constellation. Logan stood at the Meridian's forward viewport for a while, as the city fell away beneath them, watching it with the expression of a man who has left many places and has not entirely stopped noticing what that feels like. Nora was in the pilot's seat, running pre-jump calculations with the efficient focus of someone who had done this often enough that it required attention, but not anxiety. She had flown before. She had flown in things considerably less reliable than the Meridian, in time periods when the concept of a calculation error meant something considerably more permanent than a delayed arrival. She did not find flying difficult. She found it, if she was honest, one of the cleaner pleasures available to a person with an indefinite amount of time. The particular freedom of being between places, belonging temporarily to none of them. You know, Logan said from the viewport, I've been on a great many ships over the years, and I've noticed that the ones named after abstract navigational concepts are statistically more likely to experience interesting problems than the ones named after something concrete. That is not a real statistic, Nora said, without looking up. It's an observed pattern, over 4 centuries of anecdotal evidence. Anecdote is not data. Anecdote is data that hasn't been peer-reviewed yet. He turned from the viewport and moved toward the co-pilot's seat, dropping into it with the ease of a man who had learned long ago that comfort was a thing you claimed rather than waited to be offered. The steady rock never gave me a moment's trouble. Neither did the Constance or the plane, or the agricultural equipment Model 7. Nora looked at him. You did not name a ship that. I did not choose the name. I merely traveled in it. Under the circumstances, I felt the name suited. She returned to her calculations, but the corner of her mouth had moved. Just slightly. It was the kind of movement that, on another person, in another situation, might have been the beginning of a smile. On Nora, it was enough. The Meridian cleared Novel City's orbital envelope and entered open space with a smooth transition that spoke well of its engineering and reasonably well of its pilot. The stars ahead were the stars of the mid-corridor, familiar constellations to anyone who had spent time in this region, their light carrying the particular blue-white quality of the Outer Federation's less crowded skies. Logan looked at them with the same attention he had given the departing city, and Nora noticed this and said nothing about it because she understood it. She had spent enough time looking at things that most people didn't look at anymore. Tell me about the Voss archive, Logan said. You already know about the Voss archive. I know what I could find without access to records that require your particular background to locate. Tell me what I don't know. Nora was quiet for a moment, organizing something. Not reluctant, arranging the way you arrange things that have a specific shape and need to be placed in the right order to be understood. The Voss archive was established about 280 years ago by a woman named Adeline Voss, who was, depending on which account you find more credible, either a rogue Federation archivist or a private historian of significant independent means, or both simultaneously, which is more common than institutions like to admit. What was she archiving? Things the Federation hadn't gotten around to documenting yet. Things it had documented incorrectly. Things it had documented correctly, but filed in categories designed to make them difficult to find. A pause. Things it had actively chosen not to document, such as pre-Federation civilizations of the Outer Corridor, species and cultures that didn't survive long enough to be formally contacted, technologies that existed before the frameworks we currently use to understand technology existed. She adjusted a setting on the navigation panel with one hand. Evidence, in several cases, that the Outer Corridor was significantly more inhabited 4 and 5 centuries ago than the current historical consensus acknowledges. Logan turned to look at her. How significantly? The archive contains records from at least 11 distinct civilizations in the Velan Corridor alone. The Federation's official count for that region in the pre-charter period is 2. The number settled in the space between them with the particular weight of information that recontextualizes other information. Logan sat with it for a moment. Callian is one of the 11. Callian is one of the 11. And the bioresonance mapping system. Adeline Voss was thorough, Nora said. She understood that some of the technologies she was documenting operated on principles that the Federation's standard equipment couldn't read. She built or acquired specialized instruments for each of the major civilizations she was cataloging. The Callian Mapper is one of them. It was designed specifically to interface with Callian frequency transmissions and identify their spatial origin. She paused. I helped her calibrate it. Logan looked at her. You knew Adeline Voss. She found me. She was very persistent. She had a list of questions about 3 specific Callian inscriptions, and she had somehow determined that I was the only living person who could answer them, which was correct but also alarming, because it meant my obscurity was less complete than I had believed. Nora's expression carried the faint retrospective exasperation of someone recalling an unexpected visitor who turned out to be worth the interruption. We worked together for about 12 years. She was brilliant. She was also extremely difficult to have a disagreement with because she had an absolutely infuriating habit of being right. "I know the type," Logan said. Nora looked at him sideways. "Do you?" "I've been sitting across a table from one for 2 days." She turned back to the viewport. The stars had shifted slightly as the meridian adjusted its heading, the great slow-turning geometry of the corridor opening ahead of them, the distant suggestion of the Velan system's outer markers just visible as faint points of navigational light. They had 3 days of travel before the way station. 3 days in a ship the size of a generous apartment with 60 hours of calculated route between them and whatever was waiting at the archive. "Logan," Nora said after a while. "Yes." "The signal. The one the relay has been receiving." She kept her eyes on the navigation display. "Have you listened to it? It's not a format I can interpret. The Callian frequency. It's not audio. It's not data in any sense I can process. It requires a specific receiver." He watched the side of her face. "But I've had it long enough to understand certain things about its structure, its pattern. The relay responds to it, not passively, actively, as though it recognizes something." Nora's hands were still on the panel. Steady, very deliberately steady. "And what does that tell you?" she said. "It tells me that whatever is sending it knew the relay would find its way to someone who could use it. That the whole system, the relay, the signal, the archive, the mapper, it's not a message waiting to be found." He paused. "It's a path waiting to be walked." Outside the viewport, the stars moved slowly past in the ancient, indifferent, beautiful way that stars do. Nora looked at them for a long moment. Then she exhaled, quiet and slow, the breath of someone who has been waiting for something without knowing they were waiting and has just understood what it was. "Then I suppose," she said, "we should walk it." The Voss archive was not, structurally speaking, in as poor a condition as its 60-year closure suggested. This was either a testament to Adeline Voss's engineering foresight or evidence that the Federation's classification of it as structurally compromised had been, as Nora put it when they docked at its outer port, administratively convenient rather than architecturally accurate. Logan had looked at the station's exterior as they approached, its dark, unlit face turning slowly against the deep black of the corridor's outer reach, its hull worn but intact, its docking mechanisms dormant but responsive when the meridian sent the right signal, and thought that it looked less like a ruin and more like something that had been waiting, patiently, in the particular way that things built by careful people tend to wait. The way station check-in had been brief and unremarkable. The officer on duty had scanned their transit registration, noted the neutral credentials Adrian had arranged, and waved them through with the distracted efficiency of a man 3 hours from the end of a long shift who had no interest in complications. Logan had thanked him. The officer had not looked up. It was, Logan reflected, a quietly perfect interaction. Inside the archive, the emergency lighting had activated on entry. A low amber that ran along the floor junctions and turned the long corridors into something that felt less like an abandoned station and more like the interior of an old book, if books had gravity plating and recycled air that smelled faintly of preserved materials and decades of careful silence. Nora moved through it without hesitation. She knew where things were. Some of them she had helped put there. "Third level," she said. "The mapping room is at the end of the central corridor. Adeline kept it at the back because she said instruments that sensitive shouldn't have to share a wall with the docking bay." Sensible? She was sensible about equipment, less sensible about sleep schedules and meal timing, but nobody's consistent across all categories. They passed through rooms that Logan slowed to look at. Archive bays lined with storage units containing more documented history than most Federation institutions acknowledged existing, a restoration lab that still held half-finished work on what appeared to be an intact piece of Callian structural material, a small personal office with a desk that still had papers on it, weighted down against a gravity fluctuation that had presumably happened and resolved sometime in the last 6 decades. He paused in the doorway of the office. "Hers?" he asked. "Yes," Nora said. She didn't stop walking, but something in her voice did. The mapping room was at the end of the corridor, exactly where she had said it would be, behind a door that required a biological key that Nora provided by pressing her palm flat against a panel that should not, by any conventional standard, have still been active after 60 years and was. The door opened. The room beyond was dark for a moment, and then the instrument at its center began, slowly and with the particular dignity of very old technology resuming work it had never considered finished, to illuminate. It was larger than Logan had expected, a central console of Callian-influenced design, all curved surfaces and integrated components, nothing modular, nothing replaceable, built as a single continuous object the way Callian engineering tended toward, surrounded by a ring of secondary instruments that Adeline Voss had added, her own technology in conversation with theirs, a 280-year-old dialogue between a human archivist and a civilization that had been gone for centuries before she was born. The display surface above the console began to resolve from darkness into a faint, complex light. Not the binary clarity of Federation screens, but something more layered, more organic. A visual language that operated on depth rather than surface. Nora stood before it and was, for a moment, entirely still. Logan watched her. He had watched her, across 2 days of interrogation rooms and 3 days of transit and corridors that smelled of old knowledge. With the particular attention of a man who has carried a person in his memory for 400 years and is still in the continuous process of reconciling the memory with the reality. She was not what he had remembered, because memory simplified and the reality of Nora did not simplify. She was more than the version he had carried. She was also, he had realized somewhere over the second day of travel, aware of being watched, and had chosen not to say anything about it, which he thought was either courtesy or something kinder than courtesy. She placed her hands on the console. The display shifted, deepened, and a sound emerged that was not quite sound, but was received as sound. The Callian frequency made briefly, partially perceptible, a tone that existed at the edge of the room's air and Logan's comprehension simultaneously. "It's strong," Nora said quietly. "The signal, much stronger from here than your relay suggested." "How strong?" "Close." She moved her hands slowly across the surface, reading something in the display that Logan could observe but not interpret. Her pointed ears, half hidden as always by the fall of her dark hair, had oriented slightly. A small, involuntary movement, the physical equivalent of leaning in. "The origin is in the corridor. Inner Valan. Not the outer reaches, the inner system." Her hands stopped. "Logan, tell me." "It's coming from Callian." The room held this information for a moment. Logan stood very still. Outside the archive's hull, the corridor's deep space continued its ancient, indifferent business. Light traveling from places that no longer existed toward places that didn't know they were being looked at yet, the ordinary miracle of distance and time that persisted regardless of what small creatures did in small stations in its middle. He had spent 4 centuries moving through that space, watching it, filling in its gaps, carrying things that needed to be carried. He had thought he had learned to be surprised by nothing. "Callian was destroyed," he said. "Callian was abandoned," Nora said very carefully. "There is a difference. We always said destroyed because destroyed was simpler. But I was there, Logan. I left. I didn't watch it end. No one did." Her hands moved again on the console and the display shifted into something that was clearly, unmistakably, a spatial map. The Velan corridor rendered in the Callian visual language, familiar and strange simultaneously, a home seen through a window you didn't expect to still be there. The preservation systems, the relay, the archive, the mapper. She looked up at the display. What if we weren't the only things they preserved? The answer to that was too large to be spoken quickly, so neither of them spoke it quickly. Logan walked forward until he was standing beside her at the console, close enough that the edge of the display's light reached him. He looked at the map. At the point of origin, deep in the inner Velan corridor, something pulsed in the Callian frequency with the steady, patient rhythm of a signal that had been sending for 25 years and was apparently entirely prepared to continue. "They built things to last," he said. "They built things to last," she agreed. He looked at her profile in the display light. She was looking at the map with an expression he recognized, not from the interrogation room, not from the Meridian's quiet transit corridors, but from a much older memory. The expression of a woman who has lived through centuries of loss and has learned to hold hope at a careful distance and is, in this moment, finding that distance harder to maintain than usual. He understood it because he had spent 400 years developing his own version of the same expression. They were, in this way, considerably more alike than their different biologies technically required. "We'll need to go there," he said. "Yes. The territorial dispute in the inner corridor is going to complicate the approach. Significantly. We'll need Adrian's help. Proper clearance, or a route that doesn't require it. Probably both." Nora turned from the display and looked at him directly. The amber light of the room was kind to both of them, which he suspected it had been designed to be. Adeline Voss, in addition to everything else, had apparently understood that people doing difficult work deserved decent lighting. "You've been carrying this for 6 years, Nora said. The relay, the signal, moving through the outer systems alone, trying to understand it. 11 years finding it? 6 years with it? Yes. You could have found me sooner. I know. There were other ways. I know that too." She studied him. "Why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment, not evasive, considering. The answer existed. He was finding the right shape for it. "Because I needed to be certain," he said. "Before I brought this to you, I needed to understand enough of it to be sure that what I was asking you to do wasn't—" He paused. "You've already lost it once. Callian, everything that was there. I didn't want to bring you back to that without being as certain as I could be that there was something real waiting on the other side of the journey." Nora looked at him for a long time. The display behind her continued its slow, deep pulse, the signal from the inner corridor steady and patient as a heartbeat. When she finally spoke, her voice was even, but it was the evenness of something that has been moved and has chosen to remain standing. "You are," she said, "still the same infuriating, thorough, overly cautious person you were 400 years ago. I prefer careful. I know you do. Also, I've learned 2 instruments since then. You mentioned." The corner of her mouth moved. This time it continued moving until it became the thing it had been approaching for 2 days. A real smile, unhurried and unguarded. The smile of a woman who has lived long enough to know the difference between things that matter and things that don't and has just been reminded, unexpectedly, that this matters. "Let's go back," she said. "Talk to Adrian. Plan the approach." She looked once more at the map, at the pulsing point in the inner corridor, and her expression settled into something that was not quite hope and not quite certainty, but occupied the honest territory between them. "And then let's go see what survived." They left the mapping room and walked back through the amber corridors of the Voss archive, past Adeline's papers, past the half-finished restoration work, past the bays of documented history that the Federation had found convenient not to know about. Logan walked beside her and Nora walked beside him, and the station turned slowly in the deep of the corridor outside, holding its knowledge the way it had always held it, patiently, in the good faith that someone, eventually, would come back for it. The meridian was where they had left it. The stars beyond the docking port were the stars of the outer Velen corridor. Old light, traveling far. Logan paused once at the port and looked at them, the way he always looked at things, with the full and particular attention of a man who has learned that paying attention is both the simplest and the most radical thing a person can do with an extended amount of time. Nora paused beside him. She did not look at the stars. She looked at him looking at the stars, which she had decided, somewhere between Novel City and here, was something she was no longer going to pretend not to do. 411 years, she said quietly. Not as a complaint or a wonder, but as a simple, true thing being said out loud for the first time. "Give or take," he said, "and you still can't arrive anywhere without causing an incident." To be fair, the registry had never failed before. I think that reflects well on me. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "It does, actually." He turned to look at her. She was already moving toward the Meridian's entrance, her dark hair falling across the tips of her ears, the faint luminescence of her skin catching the last of the docking port's amber light and doing something with it that the light had not expected. He watched her go with the expression of a man who has carried something a very long way and has finally, carefully, put it down in exactly the right place. Then, he followed her in, and the door closed, and the Meridian held them both. And outside, the stars continued their long, faithful work of crossing the distance between where things begin and where they are finally understood. We've reached the end of another story, friends. If you enjoyed the story, please don't forget to click the like button. Leave your thoughts about the story in the comments below, and subscribe to our channel for the next science fiction story. See you in the next story, friends. Goodbye.